Bert G. Kurtstetter Ethics and Environment Conference on Environmental Justice. I'm Kim Smith. I'm the Barron Visiting Professor in Environment and Humanities at PEI and a visiting professor at the Center for African American Studies, which are the two principal sponsors for this event. And we have, I think, a very full and engaging program today, and so you'll want to silence your cell phones if you haven't already, because I'm sure you won't want to miss a word of this. I do want to let you know, if you take a look at the schedule, we have scheduled some breaks in the program, and you'll have a chance to mingle some more and get some refreshments in the lobby. Also, you may have noticed around the edges of the room, posters have been appearing. They're going to continue to appear. And these were made by the students that Melissa Harris-Lacewell and I had the privilege of working with this term. And they'll be here, the students will be here during the 10:15 break for a little mini poster session. So I hope you'll get a chance to talk to them about the environmental justice projects that they've been working on. Now I want to turn to introducing our keynote speaker this morning. I am both honored and a little bit intimidated to welcome Dr. Beverly Wright, Professor of Sociology at Dillard University and the founding director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. Now, of course, reading the biographies of all of our conference participants makes me feel deeply inadequate, but I find Dr. Wright's biography particularly difficult to measure up to. Just a few highlights of her career include her work on President Clinton's Environmental Justice Transition Paper, her service on the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board, and the City of New Orleans Brownfields Consortium. She also worked for many years on the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights for the state of Louisiana and the City of New Orleans Select Committee for the Sewerage and Water Board under the Morial administration. But Dr. Wright is probably best known not for her service on government boards, but for her involvement in grassroots environmental activism. Through the Deep South Center, she promotes community-university partnerships that address environmental and health inequities in the lower Mississippi River Industrial Corridor. Since Hurricane Katrina, the center has been focusing on health and environmental restoration, advocating the safe return of residents, and providing education, training, and job placement to displaced citizens. When she isn't working with her students, community residents, or the hordes of college students who descend on the Deep South Center during spring break, she's educating the rest of the nation about environmental justice at events like these. So please welcome Dr. Beverly Wright.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I believe that I was mostly intimidated by the walk in these 2-inch heels from the hotel to the Fritz Center. It just reminds me that I am 60 years old this year and out of shape, for certain. But I'm trying very hard to get back in shape. I want to talk to you this morning about Katrina, but also really about the change that has taken place in my city. And I call New Orleans my city because Hurricane Katrina actually helped me to find out that New Orleans absolutely is my city. When everyone was rushing out of town, those who could, because of the threat of Hurricane Katrina, my family began looking around for places where we could go nearby. Many of my friends had relatives in what we call upriver, small towns on the edge of the Mississippi River. And, I looked at my family members and said, well, where is our family? Where did we come from? Well, we actually came from New Orleans, and that was a real problem. I can trace my heritage back 8 generations in the city of New Orleans. On one side, from free coloreds who came from Haiti initially, and then on the other side from slaves brought to the city of New Orleans. And so Katrina made me know that New Orleans was absolutely home for me, and I had to go all the way to Atlanta, Georgia, to find family members um, who could comfort me through the storm. Now, I should have asked before you left, which one of the buttons do I press on this machine to make it move forward? Is it just the, nope, is it this one? No. Which one? The bottom one? I don't want to mess, if I touch it, it may all disappear. Just yes, tell me which one. View and oh, I had to do something else. And slash. Okay. Now which one? Right, so next. This one. Okay, that's what I was pressing. Thank you. I'm dangerous on the computer in my office. No one wants me near anything I might destroy it for you. Okay, just to start off, this is just a picture that I like to show because when I began to know who I was, this is one of the oldest memories that I have, and it's Mardi Gras, and I can absolutely remember as a young girl hearing the tambourines in the background. Just, it seemed like far away, almost the sound that you hear when sirens are coming because of a fire. So you hear it, and it's very faint, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. And I remember hearing the rustling in the house and everyone running out to the front porch. And of course, as a little kid, I did the same thing. I followed my parents out to the front porch. And when I looked up the street, I could hear the noise getting louder, and I just saw all of these people in these costumes, and I couldn't determine where the sidewalk ended and the street began. That's how crowded it was. And I remember feeling frightened, you know, as a kid by all of this commotion and music. And then I remember gazing in my parents' faces, and my relatives who all lived nearby, next door and across the street, were all out. And I saw the smiles. And then I began to watch them sort of gyrate with the music, you know, back and forth. So as a kid, looking at all of this, of course, we followed suit. We started dancing around, and I specifically remember one of my cousins telling me, as I began, you know, throwing my hands in the air and jumping up and down and around, I guess I looked pretty foolish, and she said to me, "No, that's not the way you do it." So from about 3 years old, I began learning this particular dance, that is the dance of Mardi Gras, what's called the second line. It's not just jumping around. There are specific steps, and most people don't know that. And as I grew up, I began to realize that this was about as close to a traditional culture as I could get in the United States, because everything related to this holiday is based on timing. There's a time to begin making costumes. There's a time for different ceremonies. And as I began to learn more about traditional cultures, I looked back at the kind of celebrations that we had, and it looked exactly like some traditional culture activity. So this is my fondest memories of New Orleans. And we have all kinds of things called step clubs, and it goes on and on. So I like to start with something fun and then go to the really ugly stuff that will depress you. But nonetheless, we can get started. Before Katrina, the city of New Orleans was nearly 70% African American. People would say 64, 65%. It's really about 70% because, as you know, poor people don't like to be counted, and that's why it's pretty much off. All of the major political offices were held by African Americans. We had a sizable black middle class, contrary to what most of you saw on the television. It looked as if New Orleans was just made up of pitifully poor black people, all of us bunched together living in the lower Ninth Ward. That is not the city of New Orleans. And we have an even larger lower middle and working class community. The city of New Orleans, like most urban areas, although it was only about 500,000 people, but it looked more like a very large city. We had an extremely high poverty rate with 35% poverty rate, with 80% of those being African American. Had a lot of low-paying jobs, which of course supported tourism. It's not like New York or Las Vegas, you know, where you can be a waitress and still have health care. It was not at all like that. We're talking about very low wages. And the hotel industry in the city of New Orleans actually grosses larger profits than other comparable cities. That's mostly because they pay our people such low wages. The city has an enormous healthcare problems with looming health disparities among African Americans. That's not so different from most large cities. And we had insufficient state and local funding for health care. We had an enormous amount of environmental contamination and environmental problems, Superfund sites, brownfield sites, and other toxic facilities in close proximity to communities and schools. In fact, New Orleans is in what we call Cancer Alley, and that is, it runs along the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor. It's an 85-mile stretch of land along the Mississippi River that is home to approximately 136 petrochemical plants and 6 refineries. And those of us who live there live in very close proximity to these facilities. In fact, 80% of African Americans live within 3 miles of a toxic facility along this corridor. So you can really see the disparities in siting when you look at the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor. Before Katrina, the city of New Orleans, in my opinion, was about as polarized racially as I have ever seen it. And most people don't know that, but there were enormous fights going on. Gentrification of historically black neighborhoods, in particular with the destruction of public housing, particularly in particular the St. Thomas Project, which was the first in our city to be taken over or destroyed. There's been a lot written about how that happened and how African Americans in particular were displaced. And of course now, since Katrina, that's no longer a discussion. They're all being torn down, even though there's a big fight looming. The bulldozers have already started, which means that even if poor people win their suit, there's no case. So there's been a rush to destruction with no place to put the debris, for example. You just see bricks sitting there, and we don't have a comprehensive waste management plan. So we're all wondering what the hell are they going to do with all of this. But the point was to get rid of them quickly, and so housing for the poor would be a moot point. So the housing projects before Katrina were being replaced by high-cost condominiums and single-family homes, but what it did in particular was actually changed the political structure of the city of New Orleans nearly overnight. The St. Thomas Project is uptown. If you know, uptown is where Tulane University is, so that you know exactly where I'm talking about. And the destruction of that housing project meant the displacement of at least 6,000 to 9,000 African Americans overnight. Now that took place without any plan for providing shelter or homes for poor people. And what happened was they were then displaced throughout the city of New Orleans. Most of them were placed in what you would consider middle class, lower middle, and upper middle class black neighborhoods, and the crime rate went through the roof. You began to see that New Orleans was the most dangerous city in the country. Well, I think an introductory sociology student could have told them that if they had destroyed the housing of poor people and sent them to places other than where they lived, that you're going to see a lot of fights going on, turf fights over drugs and animosities between neighborhoods that historically have not gotten along, like the 7th Ward versus the 6th Ward versus the 9th Ward. That's exactly what they did. All of my friends uptown, however, were very happy. And they couldn't understand why I wasn't. You know, I began to see more people walking with dogs, and all of that's really nice. You know, but what about the rest of us, in that your solution for poverty was just to move poor people someplace else, not to solve the poverty problem, which means poverty is still there. And what they're seeing now is just moving poor people does not get rid of crime. And so they're crying now, once again, we have this horrible crime rate. Well, until we do something about poverty, that's exactly what we're going to have. Racial polarization was around a number of things. This is before Katrina, folks. Residency requirement for police officers. And me and my white friends would always get into arguments about this. You know, their thing was, it doesn't matter where the police officer lives. We just need more police. I said, well, it may not matter to you, but officer friendly is not always that friendly to me. In my neighborhood, I'd rather know that the person was from the city, and it was more likely that it might be somebody that I would know who might treat me a little differently rather than pulling a gun immediately when they see me. These are the kinds of experiences that people of color have that white people don't have, and many of them have no sympathy for it or even empathy, and they don't understand it. Now, when Dr. Beverly Wright says it, they kind of listen, you know. They'd say, well, Beverly's not crazy. She's not paranoid. Maybe she's telling the truth. So I try to say this all the time. And I could share a lot of stories with you, things that have happened to me personally and to children in my family, particularly black males, but that would take too long. And that's not my mission today. Chartered schools was also a big fight before the storm with my white friends and what I would call upper middle class black people wanting to just carve out this special little place for their kids on public money. And my response always is, if you want a private education for your children, pay for it. That's what I did, you know. So if you want to be separated from poor children and all of this, then buy it. Not use public funds to do it. So that was another fight. State takeover of public schools. The state took over our public school system from an all-black school board. The state can't take care of the state, which I think Katrina showed that. So we're wondering, why the hell would the state want to take over public schools when they can't handle the state? It's been a laughable situation if it were not for the children who are suffering. We have 3 separate school districts in the city of New Orleans right now. The chartered school district, the state-controlled, and then one that's still run by the school board, which means that most children are not getting educated at all. Indictment of black public officials. Every black public official in the city has been indicted for something. Now, it's really interesting because after that happened, the majority of the contracts in the city now are all with white people, and every white person that had a contract in the city has not been indicted. Even more so, any black person that had a contract in the city and was in partnership with a white person, guess what, has not been indicted. And so the move has been that if you get a contract from the city, you have to have this partnership, 55-45, 55% white-owned, 45% black-owned. This was put in place by our present black man. He thinks that this is the way to get things straight. So white is right, black is wrong, you know, and we're not capable of running a city, which kind of feeds into this whole, what I call racism. As it relates to government. Livable wage, big struggle before the storm. In fact, we had made a lot of strides. We actually got the mayor to say, I think livable wage would be a good thing for the city. You know, we finally got him to say that. And of course, that would mean that maybe people who wait tables could buy a house, or maybe buy insurance. And maybe it would mean that the city would be a lot richer than what it's been in the past because people were making a decent wage, just maybe. Katrina ended that, and then we had racialized space. And that is that we had certain areas of the city where black people lived and other areas where white people lived. So the lower 9th Ward in New Orleans East, where I live, was considered black. And of course, Uptown and Lakeview, which is the only place in the city that got some levee protection during the storm that failed, is mostly white. This is what anticipating Katrina looked like. I'm certain that by now most of you had seen this. This is what they call contraflow. And this is what most of us feared. Some people don't know that 3 months before the storm, we did this, anticipating a storm. People on the side of the road, you know, it's not an easy thing to evacuate a city, especially if you wait like a day before the storm is supposed to hit, you know. If you're that brilliant to just wait till the last minute, then it might be very difficult. But even when you have the best plan, it's very difficult. I had 2 elderly aunts and an elderly uncle, a dog and a cat, and within our family, we had to move these old people. I don't know if you know anything about the personality of a old retired school teacher. But we had three old retired school teachers, 2 women and 1 man who wanted everything exactly the way it should be, even though we were on the road and the dog and the cat had to come. Well, that was 3 months before Katrina. When it was time for Katrina again, guess what those old people told us? I'd rather just die here. I'm not doing it. We had elderly people in the car for 24 hours to get to Houston, Texas. And if you can imagine what that was like, a lot of them didn't want to go. We literally had to force them to leave because they had just decided they'd rather stay than take that drive. Now, I'm talking about middle class, very educated, black people. So you can imagine what it was like for poor people who had no money. They had to wait until Friday to have enough money to buy gas and to pay for a hotel, right? These are things that people who have money don't realize, that some people live check to check by week to week. So if a storm comes and it's not Friday, it's very likely you don't have gas money and certainly no money for a hotel. So it's not an easy thing to empty out a city. After Katrina, this is what Katrina looked like. Coming in, these pictures are still very frightening to me when I look at it. It's unbelievable. And these are just some of the faces of Katrina. The people most hurt were people of color, or black people in particular, and poor people and the elderly. We even had the case of euthanasia at one of the hospitals where people thought that a particular doctor was actually killing the elderly to save them from what they thought to be the end of the world almost. Just some reminders. This is the Superdome, the place that, as big as it was, for some reason, the Army couldn't drop water there. They couldn't hit this huge target, which was an amazing thing to me. How you couldn't get water at the Superdome, just if you had just dropped it nearby, people would have been able to get water, and some people wouldn't have been as sick as what they were. And this is what it looked like when they were escaping the city. If you take out the buses, it looks like a third world country, doesn't it, after a war. But that is actually in the city of New Orleans, and this is what it looked like. My ex-husband, actually, who was very stubborn, which is probably why he's my ex, refused to leave again, and he ended up in the mausoleum where his mother and father were buried for 5 days on the 4th floor with about 300 people and about 100 dogs. And then he had to walk, I think it was 8 miles, to a particular point where he could be picked up. And he's a very healthy, man, very healthy, working out. And when I saw him, he looked like hell. I'm telling you, I almost didn't recognize him. It was such a hard experience. So you can imagine what it was like for elderly. What happened, we all know, the levees were breached. A lot of people don't know about the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, which actually was the reason for the flooding of New Orleans East, where I lived in the Lower Ninth Ward. It was a channel that was built for large ships to reach the port of New Orleans more quickly. But what it also brought to us was surge very quickly, 80 miles sooner than what we would have gotten it before the storm, and it increased the impact of the surge. And of course, coastal erosion, which the petrochemical industry has a lot to do with. By the way, they're now very interested in coastal erosion. And do you know why? It's because their big tanks are being exposed. And so they need that protected. That's probably the main motivation for the oil company being interested in coastal erosion. But now they're very interested in coastal erosion. And so what we need to understand, if not for failures in the levee system, flooding would have been minimal and short. At least this is what a lot of people believe. I'm not sure about that, but since it's been printed and cited by some scientists, I decided I would say it. I really believe that if the pumps for the city had been elevated above sea level, we certainly would have had flooding, but we would have been able to contain it somewhat. It wouldn't have been 6, 8 feet for, like almost 2 weeks. Maybe it would have been 3 feet for 2 weeks. I don't know. But I think if people had 2 or 3 feet of water, they would have been much more interested in coming back. That's not dealing with all of the contamination that came as well. So there are a lot of things. So it's basically a question of protection, and I usually do this for most of my students. Many of them now have seen this because of the Al Gore film, but I'll show it very quickly anyway. This is what the British do. I'm always fascinated by this. It looks like a James Bond movie to me. It doesn't look real, but you do know they're trying. I don't know if it works, but I know they're trying. It's a hell of a try, right, to hold back water. This is what the Dutch do. I mean, that's a hell of a try, I think. Can't tell you how it works, don't have a clue. But I just know it must hold back some water. If not all of it, some of it, right? This is Venice. Of course, I hear they're losing, but they have tried, and they're still trying. And now the richest, most powerful, and technologically advanced nation on earth, the USA, Army Corps of Engineers. That's one of our levees, folks. Before the storm, this is what some of them looked like. There were some that looked a lot better, and they broke as well. But it looks like I could kick this over. I could just walk up and, But I'm telling you, and a lot of you are looking amazed at this. If you go around the United States, I guarantee you see a lot of cities with levees that look like this. We're not doing anything to protect most of our major coastal cities. It's something to be concerned about. These are just some statistics on the households and the water and where the people went. We all know now they went all over the United States. And Katrina left behind a whole lot of stuff that we hear nothing about anymore. Lots of contamination. And it's hardly any discussion. Before the storm, it was like, oh my God, this is going to be the worst environmental catastrophe in the United States. And then after Katrina, you hear anything about that anymore? What happened to all that contamination? Guess what, folks? It's still with us, except for what the good Lord gets rid of through nature. And it's a good thing we have Mother Nature, because we'd be in really bad shape if it was not for some of the things that occur naturally. And so these are statistics. I'm not going to go through them if you can read quickly, because I understand I have 30 minutes, probably almost through that now. There was also a lot of health threats, and I see you have Wilma Super here today. She'll tell you a lot more about that. I'm just going to kind of gloss over it a little bit, but, the drinking water systems were contaminated and broken, and believe it or not, right now we have pipes leaking in the city of New Orleans all over. It's going to cost $4.5 billion, I think, to fix the sewage and water system in the city of New Orleans. If they just give us back some of our money, the taxes from our offshore drilling, we'd probably be in pretty good shape. But I found out that's very difficult to do. I did one of those lobby days with a group that we call Women of the Storm. I love that name, Women of the Storm. And it's a lot of, many of the women involved are civic-minded and very wealthy. I was one of the few civic-minded but poor. On this private plane that we had, it was really a fabulous occasion. We had our own umbrellas, and it was just so nice to see these very rich ladies being that interested in, the city and bringing it back. Really very nice women, just lucky enough to marry rich men, Some of us have not been that lucky. We just married men. Some of us have married 2 men. That's me. Divorced for the second time. Still trying. But on that trip, I got a chance to visit some of the offices of our state. I'm sorry, not state. I get them confused because they're all doing the same thing, nothing. Our congressional delegates. And I was sent to Michigan, to that office. And it was really amazing to me because I was in there with this whole speech about the amount of money that we generate and why we needed to get some of our tax dollars back. And this young man told me, he said, well, I don't think I can support this. I said, well, why? He said, because, in Michigan, we need this money for the clean up the Great Lakes. I said, the Great Lakes, okay. Let's see, I was in college in 1969, and I remember all of the money we were pouring to clean the Great Lakes. I said, have you heard that saying, the goose that killed the golden egg? Is that it? That laid the golden egg? Yeah. I said, so Louisiana is that goose, and if you kill it, you have nothing. I said, and if you don't do something to deal with coastal erosion in Louisiana, guess what? All that money that's coming, mostly going to you, but we're suffering. All the consequences of all that drilling won't be there. And you know what he said to me? I never thought about it like that. And my question was, I understand Michigan. I really wish that we had people in Louisiana working as hard for us. You can't blame Michigan for trying to get all it can. I don't blame them. We just have stupid people representing us, because they didn't fight for us. So how do you let all of this money go away and do nothing? And I came to one conclusion, because I thought about this. What would make Louisiana Congress people not fight for Louisiana, not fight to bring money back? Well, it's really simple. When you think back, Louisiana spent most of its time fighting for segregation. They couldn't even see what was going on around them. They were so busy trying not to go to school with black children. And so as long as they got that, they didn't look at anything else. When you look back at what they stood for and what they were fighting for, it was all about race. And in the meantime, Michigan was looking out for Michigan. And the South became the playground of the North. But guess what? Your playground is sinking. And I went to school in Buffalo, New York. And I ran back to Louisiana. Ran back. That weather is harsh. And everybody's trying to get away from that ice and snow. You know what I'm saying. So, so they went to Florida. They went, kayaking in Louisiana and everything. Well, if you don't take care of the South, we won't have any of that. And that's my soapbox. I need to move on. You have to do this to me, like I could get carried away. I don't teach anymore. I just lecture, and I really miss it. So when I get this captive audience, I get so excited. I just go on and on. Katrina also devastated homes. I lost about 3 of them. I had at least 3 homes that could be counted in this 180,000. As many as 30 to 50,000 homes citywide may have to be demolished. That process is on the way, and that, of course, brings on all kinds of problems. I think Wilma might talk about that a little bit. I'm not sure. But the asbestos in the old housing, and now with the destruction of the housing projects, right after they started tearing them down, people began rushing to the hospital with viral or bacterial infections. Because there's a way to do safe deconstruction. We don't do anything right. Louisiana, it seems. I love it because it's home, but I'm telling you, we have some issues. And so a friend of mine said they drove out, and these are new pictures that I have. I don't have them up yet to show you the destruction of the housing projects. And they said there was one little guy with a hose standing there with water like this. And the housing projects are enormous. So for safe deconstruction, so I've been told, we do a little hazmat training. You really need a lot of water spraying on all of that stuff so it's not airborne. That didn't happen, and people have been sick. Schools, the whole school system closed, from Louisiana all through Mississippi and parts of Alabama. Large numbers of kids displaced. The New Orleans public schools shut down completely. All of the school teachers fired, unable to return. You know what that does to the economy when the schools don't reopen. Tulane University is the largest employer in the state, the university. Then after that, you probably go to the public schools. So you have all these school teachers who are connected to people who work at schools. That's a large percentage of your population unemployed. August 29th, Katrina came. Just some pictures. Everybody talks about the Lower Ninth Ward. That's the barge that actually broke through the levee wall, and all of the water came in and destroyed that area. And there's a barge sitting there, and this is what it looked like after the water came in and destroyed the houses that were there. This is the Lower Ninth Ward. This is the area where I lived, and this is actually on my street. And that's what it looked like after we got people to drag all of our belongings out. That's what the street looked like when I first returned. Does race matter is a question that everyone asks, and I just have to use one example to get people to see what I'm talking about. The building plan. I will never forget this as long as I live. I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My phone started ringing early in the morning, off the hook. All of my friends calling. We have to get to New Orleans. We have to get to New Orleans. Have you seen the building plan? No. Well, the building plan actually talked about places where that would not be rebuilt. And somebody made the decision to turn certain areas into green space. Nobody talked to me about that. You know, we weren't involved in the development of the plan. And let me show you where I live. I have to show you this. This is where my house is. You see that big green spot? I said, hell no. This is my house. You know, it's in a paper, and somebody's decided that I'm not going to turn. They're going to turn my house into a green space. Well, guess what? In New Orleans East, where I live, there are 7 what you would call exclusive communities. These are communities built on man-made lakes. We have the largest park in the city. It's called Joe Brown Park. We already have walking trails. We didn't need green space in New Orleans East. You know, now if you're talking about green space so that uptown and the rest of the city could be safe, so you could just flood out where we live so other people wouldn't have to worry about water, well, then that might make sense to some people. But you were actually looking at land, the majority of which in New Orleans East was owned by black people. And you're looking at, for the first time, first generation, maybe second generation inherited property, all gone. And then they gave us another plan showing areas cited for immediate rebuilding. You can see that out where I live, there's nothing there, just the yellow spaces. And most of that was land that hadn't been touched by water. And of course, if we did a racial map, it would be where mostly white people live. The big losers. Majority African American communities gone, black majority political structure gone, minority owned businesses, minority inherited wealth, loss of cultural heritage, loss of community, loss of place, a racialized space as we call it, loss of black middle and working class, loss of black home ownership, loss of black voting strength. The big losers in the city of New Orleans were mostly African American, and we haven't seen very much but talk in relationship to our maintaining what we had before the storm. And so for all the reasons we all already know, and for no reason at all, race matters. I can't solve the race problem. I can just tell you what's going on. There are lots of other problems. Agency double talk in particular, EPA. And I know for certain women's going to talk about this. When we were getting ready to go back home, we knew that there were dangers there. We couldn't get EPA to say anything. So it was mostly nonprofit organizations and community-based organizations that worked to get the word out, to tell people to use protective gear. Then, of course, they told us the city is absolutely safe, but take these precautions with your children. That doesn't sound safe to me. If children can't play outside, they can't dig in the dirt, that's not really safe. So we knew better. And then the statistics also showed us that what they were telling us was not true. Looked at arsenic and lead, and of course, in many areas, the levels are above accepted levels. These are, I'm going to skip that one. Differences in soil screening levels. We had NRDC actually did the sampling for us, and they actually pulled from EPA's own data. And we looked at the number of samples that exceeded what EPA said to be safe, and as you can see, there were quite a few. Then we looked at other issues like settling insurance claims, and once again, we found that African Americans were kind of left out. In fact, I didn't even know that there was a special office at the state level where you could file a claim or a complaint. I found out from my girlfriend, my white girlfriend, and this is a joke that we have. Every black person should have at least one very close white friend. You know why? There's a communication network that we seem to be left out of, and it certainly shows. And I have a PhD. I'm not dumb. So why I don't know. People say, well, poor people, they don't read the paper. I do all of that. I still didn't know. So there's something going on here. I haven't figured it out, but I have resolved it. I always call my white friends and say, what's going on? And they tell me, and then I call my black friends and I say, girl, we better get down to that office right now, It's just the way it is. I don't know why. Road home met with roadblocks. This is what I called it. This is how some of our houses look. Would you buy this house? I mean, I swear I just wouldn't. New Orleans is going to be really ugly before it's over with. And I keep asking the question. So you raise your house 4 feet. I had 8 feet of water. So after I raise it 4 feet, I'll still have 4 feet of water in my house. But I also have an ugly house. Who wants it? Nobody does. So if we don't fix this levee problem, if we don't deal with coastal erosion, we can all forget it. We got to do something different. They're making New Orleans a very ugly place. Oh, is that 2? Okay. Not clean enough for horses. For any of you who ever go to Jazz Fest in New Orleans, you are safe. Because guess what? They absolutely did a hazmat cleanup at the racetrack. They removed all the topsoil. They put down clean dirt for the horses. $1 million horses are worth a lot more than me and you. So they got what we all asked for. That was a real soil remediation project in the city of New Orleans, which would have made New Orleans the safest city, urban city in the country. No, they wouldn't do that. They just gave huge contracts to Halliburton and gave us toxic trailers, for one thing. People sick now from formaldehyde. They spent a lot of money there, but they wouldn't do some of the common sense stuff that wouldn't have cost very much. For example, they could have given each citizen about $2,000 a grant, a $2,000 grant to remediate their soil. It would have created small businesses. It would have given people money and made a safe environment. No, they wouldn't do that. But for horses, we couldn't let our poor little horses get sick. They cleaned it up. And then looking at flood levels, this was one of the most contentious meetings that I went to. They've all been contentious, but this is one of the most contentious. We looked at, after 2 years, where the money was spent and who's been protected. Well, what we basically found that the only people who've been protected are white people, mostly rich white people. The Lakeview and Old Metairie. Now that even sounds like it's where white people live to me. Lakeview and Old Metairie. They're the only people that got some protection. I live in New Orleans East. You see East on there? 0. After 2 years, we have no more protection. Gentilly is where Dillard University is. We got 6 inches, and I think the lower 9th ward got about 2 feet of extra protection, mainly because of the attention that was placed there. We've been doing a lot of things. I'm rounding it up. Safeway Back Home was a project that my office was involved with the United Steelworkers. When I went back, I was saying, what can we do? I run a hazmat training program with young people. We've been doing it for about 13 years with a grant from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. That means I work with labor. And I also work with poor kids to give them training so they can have jobs. Talking to our consortium members, after about 3 glasses of wine, somebody said, well, how can we help you? I said, well, can we do a demonstration project? Let's clean up one city block to show the city what it should be doing. We did that. We had a press conference. We had about 180 young people, volunteers from around the country. They went through a short hazmat class, taught them how to wear the cleanup suits. We began to work on 2 weekends. That's the gang that I was drinking with when we came up with this idea. Of course, when we sobered up, we realized we must have been crazy. But we actually did it with steel workers. We removed 6 inches of topsoil, planted new grass, this is the way it looked while we were doing our work. And I love the bottom picture. You see the woman in the back with the wheelbarrow and the guy in the front sort of leading the way. The women did a lot of work. And then the Red Cross actually showed up. So you see them there. They had our Oreo cookies and water. And there we are putting the grass down with a demonstration project. That's my house at the top with the hose on the side. That's putting grass down. It's my 84-year-old neighbors right now who had the highest arsenic levels on their lawn with samples from EPA. This is where it looked right after. We had our own sign. We had a block party. There we are eating, celebrating, and of course politicians show up when you do something good. So at each side of me are my city council persons, and this is what we call the tipping point, because this is actually a house around the corner. This house looked like this before we finished. Because I was talking all over, and I told people what to do. So I went up to her house, I knocked on the door, I said, my God, she said, oh, the environmental lady. She didn't know my name, and she said, I told her, you go out there and you do everything that environmental lady told you to do. So Harry did it, and this is her house is beautiful. And we've seen houses coming up all around us with people taking their own initiative, doing what we asked. This is what my house looked like. We're doing a healthy rebuilding project with money from HUD, doing green sheetrocking, storm windows, soil remediation. This is actually a clean room where we're showing people how to set up a room to work in if you have to live in your home. We have I don't have time. Here are students working as well. We have a Katrina Survivors Project in 3 different states. Race Matters. Okay, it's freezing. I don't have time for this. Just wanted to show you that they're fence line communities. I think somebody else is going to talk about this. This is Marjorie Richards. We actually got one community to be relocated. Environmental justice is global. In Nigeria, we've seen exactly the same thing happening with the same companies. There are some successes, mostly driven by women. The problem is actually global. And I wanted to show you this because this is in South Africa, where the tanks and stuff are so close to where people live, refineries and so on. But this is the thing. I'm taking pictures trying to get one slide together. I got confused because I thought I had one picture. And I said, oh, that's not the same. It turns out one is South Africa, the other is Norco. Different children, but the same. The same thing is happening to the same people around the world. It's global in that. In Louisiana, in South Africa, I visited a plant called Thor, where people were dying of mercury poison. I later found out it's from Borden Chemicals in Louisiana. That had a huge fine for mercury. Same thing. So this thing is all connected. We have some winners. Marjorie Richards, who got the Goldman Award for fighting for a fence line community. Why are we doing this work? Toxic waste and race basically show that minorities are mostly exposed, the closest to toxic contamination. That's a very old picture. And then we look at toxic waste at 20 years later, and we find that the situation is actually worse. It's not better. This is why we do this work. We want to fight for a better world, a cleaner world, a greener world, a sustainable world. And then we know that all people will, in fact, be protected. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, and I don't think any of us really believed that 40 minutes was going to be long enough for everything that you've done and know about. But because we are running a little bit late, I want to move on to the first panel immediately. So if our panelists would come up, and David Schlossberg and Susan Cutter and Melissa Harris-Lacewell. Let me check on that.
Good morning. My name is Melissa Harris Lacewell, and I'm an associate professor of politics and African American studies here at Princeton. And most importantly, this semester I have had the amazing opportunity of co-teaching a course on environmental justice with Professor Kimberly Smith. And in some ways, this conference is a bit like our syllabus coming to life and walking around in front of us, which is pretty amazing, both for us, I hope also for our students. So what we're going to do is move directly into the panel discussions, but I do want to just pause for a moment and say how much I appreciate having Kim Smith here this semester, how much I have enjoyed, or this year rather, how much I have enjoyed teaching with her this semester, and how much this effort of this conference is really her vision and her work. So thank you so much, Kim. So I think we're going to start with David from Northern Arizona University. Because the bios are in your packets there, I won't read them for you, since everybody here, as Beverly said, is smart and able to read those. But we do have, again, kind of this great opportunity with David from Northern Arizona and Susan from the University of South Carolina to talk about these environmental justice issues from different vantage points within the country itself. Yes, right, the Princeton talk. That's great.
That was the idea.
That's pretty funny.
Well, I'll just get going anyway. Just a little bit different. I'm a political theorist, and I wrote a book a few years ago on the politics of the environmental justice movement that was mostly looking at the sort of innovative structure of the movement, the horizontal nature of the movement, the network structure of the movement, as well as some of the demands of the movement, much more around communication and participation. And after I published that, somebody asked how I could write a book as a political theorist about the environmental justice movement without defining what I meant by justice. And my response to that was, well, first of all, that's not my job, because in two ways. One, that's not what the book is about, and second, because that's up to the movements to define. That's up to the movements to decide what justice means. And so I spent a few years working on this issue of defining what justice meant. There we go. And I wrote another book that came out last year that really has as its basic task this question of what is meant by justice in definitions of environmental justice and ecological justice. And I actually talk both about the environmental justice movement, and then I try and take this framework of justice, and also apply it to doing justice to nature. So the central argument of the book is that a theory and practice of environmental justice necessarily includes ideas of distributive justice, the concept of equity, as many political theorists write about, but it also has to embrace, because movements bring these issues up, justice that's based in recognition, in political participation, and also in capabilities, and both at the individual level and the community level, which is something that political theorists really have a hard time with, getting beyond this idea of justice to individuals and understanding it as applied to communities. Now, I see implications for this for both innovations in justice theory and political theory, but also in the political strategy of environmental justice movements, where I think my suggestions differ from some folks. So, four main points here, four main points in this part of the book anyway. The first claim, again, is a conception of environmental justice has to go beyond considering justice as based solely on distribution. Most theories of justice are on distribution. Who gets what? Why does this happen? How does this happen? And justice theory has really been about developing plans of distribution, images of distribution. But in the past couple of decades, there have been a number of authors that have gone beyond this and have criticized this approach to justice, especially feminist theorists like Iris Young and Nancy Fraser, and some other theorists of recognition like Axel Honneth. and Charles Taylor. And their argument is that you really have to get not only a distribution, but the processes that construct maldistribution. Right? So the idea here is to focus on the recognition of folks as an important element of justice. And for people that do race theory, this is fairly obvious. For justice theorists, it hasn't been. The other thing that I've focused on is a theory of justice developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum around development issues. But they focus on capabilities. They focus on justice being the ability, the capability of individuals and communities to have fully functioning lives. And the injustice is on the interruption of that ability. So the point here isn't just theoretical. My point in doing this whole book was to look at the way the concept of justice is defined by movements themselves. And I looked at not only groups in the U.S., but also global movements that use environmental justice as an organizing strategy, and that includes groups who organize against the global economy and neoliberalism, groups that are focused on food security, on indigenous rights, and also, obviously, climate justice. Now, one of the arguments that I make is that these movements illustrate that it's possible to have more than one definition of justice at once. It is possible to have a very pluralistic notion of justice that encompasses a number of different definitions, that it's pragmatic, that it's flexible, and that it's integrated. And again, the other important thing here is that for movements, as opposed to justice theory, justice is something that is experienced at the community level. And injustice is something that's experienced at the community level. It's not just an individual thing. And movements are very clear, and actually in talks so far we've heard a lot about the impact not just on individuals but on communities, and I'll come back to that. Now the final point really is about the relationship between the definition of justice and the strategy of the movement as a whole. Some activist scholars talk about and insist upon a very limited definition of environmental justice. And the argument here is that there's a lot of potential for a movement that already defines justice on more broad terms to define themselves more broadly. Okay, so first, just a little bit of theory. I'm not going to talk much about the idea of justice as distribution. It's pretty straightforward. Who gets what, how we can distribute goods and bads in a more just way. It's been the central focus of political theory of justice since Rawls in the 1970s. But again, there's been some criticisms from a number of theorists, and the basic argument is pretty straightforward, that distributional issues are crucial to achieving justice, but it's a mistake to reduce social justice to the idea of distribution. For Young and Fraser, the central question isn't what's the best model of distribution, but instead, how does current maldistribution get produced? And especially, if distributional differences are constituted by social and cultural and economic and political processes, any examination of justice theoretically needs to include discussions of the structures, practices, rules, norms, language, discourses, and symbols that mediate social relations. Again, this doesn't mean that we ignore distributional issues, and the movement illustrates this. You don't just ignore distributional issues to focus on recognition. You bring the two of them together. Now, there is a difference in this school of thought that I want to do very briefly. For some folks in justice theories of recognition, the issue is psychological. It's about recognition as a basic human need, something that we need psychologically in order to be complete human beings. And Axel Honneth and Charles Taylor talk about that. Recognition gives us self-worth. Fraser, on the other hand, sees recognition as based in cultural and social and political institutions, and it's status-based. So it's not just a psychological issue, it's an issue of one's status. And she talks about practices of cultural domination, practices of non-recognition or rendering individuals and communities invisible, and the third is disrespect or being routinely maligned or disparaged in stereotypic public and cultural representations. Racism and gender discrimination are clearly two forms of status-based misrecognition. And it's that institutionalized misrecognition and not just individual psychology that's central to injustice. Now, the capabilities approach takes a different tack here. The focus also moves away from distribution but not quite entirely. Sen's original idea was to move away from the simple amount of aid a person gets as a measure of the justice of development schemes. And Nussbaum as well, the argument is that we want to be able to define justice as people flourishing, as the sort of person, the sort of human being that they are. So the idea isn't really about how much stuff we get or about distribution in that sense, but if we're actually capable of transforming what we get into a fully functioning life. And so the capabilities approach examines what it is that we need as a living being to transform primary goods, if we have them, like education, like wealth, into an actual functioning life. And for Nussbaum, if we're discriminated against, we can't turn goods into a flourishing life. Without health, without bodily integrity, education, imagination, reason, the ability to affiliate with others, control our own political and material environment, we can't, if we don't have these things, expect justice, even if we get a certain amount of goods, as we wouldn't have the capacity to transfer them, to convert them into a flourishing life. And that list, by the way, comes from Martha Nussbaum. Okay, so the first point here is that there's a hell of a lot more to justice than distribution. Okay, and I'm influenced by the fact that this is what movements have been doing, and it's not just me. These theorists, especially Iris Young and Nancy Fraser, certainly come out of a social movement background and actually use the theorizing of movements themselves to push political theories. Okay, now, all I want to do here is illustrate how movements in both the U.S. and globally actually use these notions of justice. So I'm going to break this down a bit, talk about U.S. movements first, and then global movements. Now, it's obvious and central that the USEJ movement, or groups in the U.S., have been motivated by issues of maldistribution. Poor communities, communities of color, indigenous communities get more environmental bans than rich white communities. That's clear. It's something that has clearly motivated the movement. The costs of pollution, the benefits of environmental protection are not evenly distributed. And again, this is what motivated the movement through the GAO and through the UCC's original studies. But that's not the sole argument of environmental justice movements. Movements do not just talk about these inequities and these inequalities. Justice has always been also about social, economic, and political disenfranchisement, oppression and dehumanization, issues of race, class, and identity, disrespect, cultural survival, all quotes from movement literature. There's a reason why environmental justice was first defined and articulated as environmental racism in the U.S. It wasn't just the inequity, it was who. It was this lack of recognition and this disparaging of black communities. That's why the issue was first raised by civil rights organizations. So environmental justice movements act upon the idea that the root causes of environmental inequity are in social relations like racism. Some populations are valued more than others and receive more than their share of environmental bans. Now, importantly, individuals and groups see and experience disrespect as well at both the individual and the community senses. Individually, and anybody who has gone to a public hearing on environmental justice has seen this. Individuals are they're ignored. The body language of county commissioners is amazing to watch sometimes. People are seen as ignorant. They're seen as hysterical. They're seen as incapable of understanding economic development. And the eye rolling and just the language that comes from folks, the disrespect that's clear, and they're calling people by their first names as opposed to by title. Racism and misogyny are rampant in those kinds of settings. But it's not just the individual level as well. The cultural insults are broad, the lack of recognition. And I discuss, coming from Arizona, I discuss a number of Native American cases. Navajo uranium miners who didn't get the same safety equipment as white miners off the reservation. Mining companies that draw down water aquifers to slurry coal only to have springs that are crucial to tribal ceremonies and tribal identity dry up. A lambasting of land-based religion in a local newspaper, which happened after a proposal that I'll talk about in a second. And we just heard in the last couple of talks last night and this morning that community disruption, community displacement is a theme in environmental justice. And look, this is not just an issue of recognition. It has a direct impact on the actual functioning of communities. And again, in the native cases that I talk about, folks see threats to native lands as direct assaults on long-standing cultural practices. So the thing we're dealing with at home right now is a proposal to use reclaimed sewage water, reclaimed sewage water, to make snow on a mountain that's sacred to 12 tribes in Arizona. This is a place, and I can't say this strongly enough, this is a place that's absolutely central to the cosmology of Navajo and Hopi, as well as a number of other tribes. And they're basically just going to piss on the mountain so people can ski. The president of Navajo has called this plan cultural genocide. Pretty strong words coming from an elected official. This isn't just about tribes getting the bad end of distribution. It's about the lack of recognition, the lack of respect for religious beliefs, and a direct attack on the capability of a large community to function in terms of passing on their traditions. The idea is that once this mountain is poisoned, the medicinal plants won't come up, the Katrina won't come up, we won't be able to pass on our culture, our traditions to the next generation. It's actually the youth of the peaks. It's savethepeaks.org if you want to check this out. But it's the youth who are very active because they see this destruction of their own culture happening. So again, the point here is that environmental justice in the U.S. uses a variety of discourses of justice, distribution, recognition, participation, capabilities, and function at both the individual and community level. There's a protest in Flagstaff. Now, at the global level, I see the same sort of characteristics of the notion of justice. And again, I focus on some of the key issues of global environmental justice movements, or global movements that use environmental justice as an organizing theme. Movements against the WTO and other symbols of economic globalization, movements for climate justice, food autonomy and security, indigenous rights as well. And now again, clearly, part of the criticism is about inequity. Part of the criticism is about economic and distributive injustice. And the central critique, for example, of the WTO and other institutions of the world economy is this development of an inherently inequitable distribution of economic goods and the related social and environmental bans. We say the same thing in the food security movement, indigenous rights movements, climate justice. Who's going to be flooded? Who will be the environmental refugees? Who will be able to afford to protect themselves? The issue of equity is there. But simply put, equity isn't the only issue of justice addressed by these various groups. Other fundamental critiques include this relationship between social and cultural misrecognition and the lack of democratic participation in governing institutions. So there's all kinds of talk about a criticism of the global economy that includes the danger of the growing global monoculture and what this monoculture will do to local food systems, local cultures based on local food systems. So the complaint is not just that it's a livelihood and often a sustainable one that's to be destroyed, but a way of life, a region's way of life, a local culture's way of life. And resistance to these processes have been articulated as calls for the recognition of local culture. In climate justice, for example, two of the Bali principles directly address recognition. Climate justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, and an appreciation of diverse cultural perspectives. And they also explicitly call for preventing the extinction of cultures and biodiversity due to climate change. So in these cases, just as in the U.S., the first step towards justice is recognition. And the basic argument is that these ways of life are being threatened because they are not recognized, because they are not respected, because they are devalued. And that's an issue of recognition and not just of equity. We also get this link between a lack of recognition and the destruction of the capabilities and functioning of individuals and communities. One of the arguments against the WTO, for example, is that as it destroys, as it monocultures, it destroys various cultural capabilities, and it decimates the ability of cultures to reproduce themselves and their ties to the land. On the issue of climate change, capabilities are also central. The argument is that global warming reduces people's ability to sustain themselves, and that in the face of rapid change, the integrity of communities is threatened. And so in other words, both individual and community functioning is threatened. And the Bali principles get at this as well, and demand as part of climate justice fundamental rights to clean air, to water, to food, to healthy ecosystems. These are the basic capabilities that are necessary for individual community functioning. And so, a lot of the literature, a lot of the protest is not just about equity, it's also about the destruction of land and people, notions of sovereignty. So overall, the key claims here are that the definition of environmental justice is threefold. Movements demonstrate that any notion of environmental justice has to focus not just on distribution but beyond, interrecognition, capabilities, participation. The movements articulate these notions of justice at the individual community level. And finally, that it's possible to develop a notion of justice that integrates broadly these various notions of justice. They're not contradictory, they're complementary, something that political theorists can't get their head around as they argue against one another, but the movements illustrate the possibility of a broad and comprehensive political project around a number of notions. Now, in the book, I try to conclude somewhat pragmatically anyway with a discussion of the implications and the potential of this very multifaceted and pluralistic notion of justice. And I talk about the difficult question of how you reconcile multiple notions of justice that exist simultaneously. And here I refer to just a long and distinguished history of pluralist theory, but I also make some links to deliberative democracy because Sen, for example, Amartya Sen talks about the development of capabilities as something that belongs to communities. The communities develop their own list of what capabilities are necessary for themselves to function. And they do that, says Sen, in a very deliberative and democratic process. So it's not just participation in the political process, it's participation within a community to find exactly what it is that's needed for that community to continue to function. And again, it's something that we see in environmental justice movements. Now, probably the most controversial thing here is the idea that I see a link between this plurality around the notion of justice and social movement strategy. Now here, I do argue against some of the other academics writing about the U.S. movement. Getches, Pello, for example, both insist on a very limited notion of what environmental justice is. For very pragmatic grounds, they say that the narrower the definition of environmental justice, the more potential there will be to actually accomplish things. If we define too broadly, it'll be too much, we'll never get what we want. But against those authors, I think a more thorough definition of justice offers a very broad and workable frame. And in a sense, to me, the whole point of organizing around the concept justice is to broaden the appeal of the movement, to broaden the appeal of a number of different groups, and to be able to bring in groups that care about justice, that have justice as an organizing theme as well. And actually in the book what I do is also talk about ecological movements, conservation movements, and a focus on the functioning of ecological communities and the way that we can talk about environmental justice and ecological justice using the same language in order to bridge that huge gap between environmental justice and conservation movements. Now, I guess the main ending point here, the last point, is that there's a long history of this relationship between recognizing difference, recognizing plurality, and the need for engagement across that plurality or across difference. Engagement in practice, democratic engagement, participation in theory and in movement strategy really brings us to the next important step, which is institutionalizing and implementing these notions of justice. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Now we'll have Susan Cutter from the University of South Carolina.
Maybe we'll have Susan Cutter.
It's certainly very nice to be here, and as this is loading up, what I'm going to be speaking on today is looking at the geographic perspectives on environmental inequities and giving you some perspective from the spatial social sciences. And the reason for doing this is geography has been very much a player in the environmental movement for a very long period of time, yet it is one of the least understood of the social sciences in terms of its contributions not only to the environment generally, but to environmental justice specifically. Before I begin, though, I want to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of the definitions, because our community, my community, the geography and geographical sciences, may look at these things slightly differently. We view equity as simply the disproportional impacts or effects of some kind of an environmental bad on both people and places, and for us, oftentimes, our fundamental unit of analysis is place. Justice, for us, is a politically charged term that suggests that some remedial action is necessary to correct an injustice, and the racism is the overt discrimination in environmental policy, enforcement, and leadership. Now, there are, from our perspective, three forms of environmental equity. The social equity, which Beverly talked about earlier today, which is exemplified by this cartoon of the Yankee Row, which was a nuclear power plant in the north, bringing its lovely waste products to the south, the notion of the dumping in Dixie. And this is where you get questions related to race and class and gender in terms of what we mean by social equity. The question of generational equity, which was brought up last night, is what do we do to protect the future generations from the disamenities that we produce currently. And the best example of that is the whole nuclear problem, which that waste will be around for a very long period of time. And living in the South, you see this all the time. And this is a cartoon. Don't think of it as nuclear waste. Think of it as our children's future. And because I live near the Savannah River site and Barnwell, we have a lot of these issues that come to the fore. The third form of environmental equity is procedural, and this is the issue of the differential application of policies, laws, enforcement, and so on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I think we all know basically what the causes of the inequities are. Goes to the notion of the geography of difference. And there are differences between those that have and those that do not have. And this manifests itself both in terms of nations and social groups. It's a function of power. It's a function of status. It's a function of prestige. In looking at the environmental justice research, what we see are questions related to the sources of environmental threats. Is it because these threats were initially cited in communities because they were poor, minority, and politically weak? Or were these LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, actually placed in communities with very little reference to race or economic status, and then the demographics of the communities changed over time? So it becomes a chicken and egg proposition. How will the actions of powerful nations, if we fast forward this, adversely affect developing ones? And a lot of this is embodied in the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change community now, and the globalization of environmental movements. The geographic research, I want to talk about 3 specific areas where we have contributed to the understanding of environmental inequities. The social burdens of pollution, some of the methodological advancements that have been undertaken in the past few years, and the new problem sets that we're working on. Like Beverly, I've been doing this for a long period of time, and one of the first studies that looked at the differential social burden of pollution was a study done for the EPA in the mid-1970s. And it resulted in this book, and this very old cover, as you can see, called The Social Burdens of Environmental Pollution. And this was done by an urban geographer, Brian Barry, at the University of Chicago. And under an EPA contract, what he was interested in was looking at the relationship between the social structure of cities and pollution levels. And it really is the first comparative atlas of pollution and its effect on communities in the country. And not surprisingly, he found a correlation between race and class in those areas that had high concentrations of pollution, air, water, and solid waste. But I also found in some of these cities that the inner cities, where you had white affluent residents, also had high levels of air pollution at the time. And to date myself, I was a graduate student on this particular project. So hence the involvement in this community. This was one of the earlier forerunners, I think, to the UCC report, starting to look at the spatial differences in these social burdens. The methodological advancements that have been made by the geographical community have been significant. And the first is improving the positional accuracy of where the facilities are. When EPA and UCC started looking at this, they had no idea where the facilities were. And some of the early databases that came out had facilities listed as being in the Atlantic Ocean when we knew, in fact, that they were not there, which was always interesting. And then they would draw the correlations between how many people lived next to these facilities. And then if you actually plot the longitude, latitude of that facility, you're out in the Atlantic Ocean. So one of the things that the global positioning systems have done and the incorporation into geographic information systems is allow us to get a better positional accuracy. Now, in doing that, it's only as good as the reporting of the information. And so if the company is reporting its headquarters and the address for its headquarters, that's not necessarily where that facility is located. And so a lot of the effort, the early effort, particularly in the early 1990s, was in assisting EPA, frankly, in getting better coordinate system for the location of these facilities, and now it's not bad. There's still some problems with, let's say, the TRI, for example, but it's much, much better. And the use of the GPS, where you can actually go to the front gate of the facilities and take a reading, has improved it considerably. Another advancement of the geographical sciences has been to assist in trying to look at the resolution for doing a lot of the empirical studies. And some of the early research work was mixed. Some of it used cities as the unit, some used census tracts, some used block groups. And so the effective scale makes a difference in the kinds of findings that you would find. And it differs by scale as you aggregate up or as you disaggregate down. And then the last kind of methodological advancement has been how we actually delineate hazard zones. That is, where is the at-risk area? And I think one of the major contributions of my discipline has been the improvement in the locational inequity methodologies. When we started out with the UCC, it was basically the host, non-host kind of methodology. And if the facility was located in this spatial unit, and this could be a tract or a block group or a city, everybody living in this particular, let's say, census tract was deemed at risk, and the people over here were not at risk. And that's how we did a lot of the early EJ studies, was the host, non-host. Well, as we progressed through the science, we said, oh, well, this doesn't make sense. So with the advent of a lot of the geographic information systems and that particular computer-based technology, we went to a buffering methodology. That is, we could locate the facility, same facility, but now we said, aha, people over here are also at risk of sub-exposure. And so we can draw circles around this, and it's very easy to do in the GIS. The question you ask is, how large should the buffer be? And this is where you have a lot of discussion, because should it be a half a mile? Should it be a mile? Should it be 5 miles? Should it be 5 kilometers? And there's a lot of interesting suggestions in the literature about how large that buffer should be. To move from the buffering idea, and this one is still used quite frequently in empirical work on EJ. To move to the next level, one can say, all right, we know that distance will moderate a threat, and there is some distance out X location, after which time you're probably not exposed. And so can we develop some kind of a spatial model that allows us to look at distance decay? That is, the further away from the facility in any direction, you would potentially be less at risk. If we're and this assumes an equal distribution, all right? So we're not going into any of the air pollution plume modeling where you bring in wind, but in a non-wind environment, people closer to the facility would be more at risk than those further out. And so there's been a lot of improvements in our ability to model these. Just to show you one example of what that might look like, this is my state. And these are dots which represent the TRI facilities, toxic release facilities. So I can do a host, non-host kind of approach in this area, or I can do a distance decay model, and these yellow areas represent the distance decay models. This is the Charlotte area here. This is Columbia, Augusta, and Charleston, South Carolina. And the CPE is what we call the cumulative potential exposure. And what you can see is if you put all these together, you get more of a blob kind of geography than that point geography. And so we can start to compare based on metro area, for example, these particular places. And that's where a lot of this work is now going, is trying to develop a comparative frame. There's been work as well in proving environmental discrimination and broadening the choice of the environmental threat. A lot of the early work was on TRI and Superfund, but as more and more of the databases come to the fore through EPA, you can get different kinds of environmental threats. The geographic scale of analysis, which I've mentioned. A lot of the work in the geographical sciences has looked not only at race and class, but has looked at age and has also looked at gender as different subpopulations that one would be interested in looking at. There's been a lot of historic work in the geographical sciences as well, and the historical work is trying to monitor this question I posed earlier: which came first? Was the facility intentionally sited in that community because of its sociodemographic characteristics, or in fact did those characteristics change over time? And a classic case is South Carolina, where on the surface it appears as though there was an intentionality to the location of a lot of the heavy pollutant emitters. But if you go back and dig, it turns out that it was an economic development policy in the 70s that located these facilities as an economic driver in these communities to help stimulate the economy in the rural part of the state. And what has happened over time is the white population has moved out, which means the percentage of the minority population has increased. And so 30 years or 35 years later, what you see is the manifestation of an environmental injustice, when the intention and the question of intentionality in the beginning was just the opposite. The other advancement I think that's important to look at is the relative hazardousness of these spatial units. And so the idea is it's not just having a facility present or absent, but it's what's coming out of that facility and how bad is the stuff coming out. So you not only need the where question, but you need some idea on the magnitude and a magnitude estimator and toxicity and a toxicity indicator. We have scorecard. We have lots of EPA information now that is beginning to move in this direction, where you can actually find out how much and the relative level of toxicity from these facilities. You can get the rankings are widely available on Scorecard, which is one of the better databases out there. It tells you how much of what is being released grouped into different kinds of classifications. And what you have to understand is we don't have toxicity values for all of these chemicals. And so we do have to look at kind of surrogate data. And for that reason, Scorecard is very good by putting in carcinogens, toxicants that relate to developmental issues, and so forth. If you take the emissions and you use different kinds of toxicity indicators, you get a very different profile on what I like to call the risk shed. And this just suggests that you have to be very careful about which toxicity indicator that you're using, because you will get a very different kind of geography when you look at it. Again, I think because most of us are not toxicologists, using the modified scorecard is one of the best. And this is a nice cartographic representation, because the larger the circle, the worse it is. So it's a combination of both the toxicity and the quantity, the magnitude. The last contribution has been looking at new problem sets. One is the area that I'm currently working in, which is looking at vulnerability to risks and hazards, but there's quite a bit of effort looking at inequities in global environmental change. Certainly the long history of geographic involvement in Agenda 21, and now with the millennial assessment, and Dale will, I'm sure, tell us more about that at lunch. When you look at the social burdens, those locational inequity methodologies don't really work as well for natural disasters. And we also have very few systematic measures for determining procedural inequities. And so what we're left with is a problem of very little data on pre-event social burdens or vulnerability to disasters. So the social vulnerability is really looking at those characteristics of populations that influence these social burdens of risk and how those factors in turn affect the distribution of risks and losses. And we know from the social sciences that after disasters research, which has been going on for about 50 years now, starting with Gilbert White in the 40s, that we do know those characteristics of populations that tend to influence negatively their ability to recover from disasters. And we have some examples. We know that special needs populations increase vulnerability because they're difficult to identify. You're homeless or are rarely included in your census populations. They're left out of recovery efforts. We know that age makes a difference, and it's not the medium age categories, it's the very, very young and the very, very old. We know that socioeconomic status makes a difference. It both increases and decreases vulnerability. The rich have more to lose, but they also have more capacity to endure that loss. The poor, on the other hand, have less to lose, but it will wipe them out completely. Race and ethnicity, and my favorite, housing stock and tenure. If you live in the South, you know that the primary housing stock are mobile homes. And we know mobile homes are really good in high wind environments. And so mobile homes, good indicator of vulnerability, and renters in particular because they have no alternative housing shelters. Whoops. We've developed a metric that allows us to compare counties on their relative social vulnerabilities, and we call this SOVI, or the Social Vulnerability Index. Working from the case study literature, we developed a series of variables that were put into a principal components analysis, factor analysis, that generated 11 factors because many of these things are multidimensional, multi-attributal. And what we find is anywhere from 74 to 78% of the variance is explained. And what we see over time is socioeconomic status comes out as a key indicator, as does age and the density of development. Because geographers love maps, we can map it, and you can see the changes over time. The areas in red are the most vulnerable. The areas in blue are the least vulnerable. We can look at this by going in certain areas. We can see how it changes in the same place over time. And we can put this on the web so people can use it and do it in a way that people intuitively get. We understand red and blue states, so we understand red and blue counties. And by understanding the drivers, we can look at the Delta area here and know that this is a low-income African-American poverty area with female-headed households. We know that this is a Hispanic borderland area that has lots of new immigrants, families, high birth rates. We know that in this area in the Upper Great Plains is a combination of Native American lands, but also the in situ aging of the rural farm population. That includes elderly white women on fixed incomes whose access to health care and other resources is limited, so if a disaster strikes, they have very little capacity to respond. Well, now I'd like to take up where Beverly left off and talk about a case for procedural inequity, and this is Hurricane Katrina. She told you about Lakeview and Gentilly and the lower ninth. We had different impacts. We have different recovery in this area. We know that the executive order is to focus federal attention, and yet I don't see FEMA adhering to Executive Order 12898. FEMA doesn't want to hear about Executive Order 12898. So the question is, with Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans, who is the most vulnerable and therefore who is the least likely to recover? This particular photograph was taken last month in the lower 9th Ward. That barge that Beverly showed was probably right down in here if this photograph weren't taken. This is the recovery in the lower 9th. Well, we know that there was differential vulnerability in New Orleans, and applying that SOVI index to the census tract level, you see we find 78% of the variance. The areas in red are the most vulnerable. Here's the lower 9th. Here's East New Orleans. And what happens is race and class, female-headed households, housing projects came up as its own separate indicator, and the elderly. You can look at the map of the inundation area. This is the water that was over 8 feet. And if you put the two together cartographically, what you see is the juxtaposition of the most socially vulnerable people in the highest impact area due to the flooding. And I'll point right here to the lower 9th Ward. We have ways of looking at how the recovery is progressing, and we can look at the residential deliveries of mail. And keep your eye here on the lower 9th. This is July of 2005. 2006, 2007. And what you see are basically the white parts of the city are getting their mail, and everybody else is not. The question we're left with is, who is this recovery for? And it's not necessarily a question of science, but it is a question of ethics and, above all, politics. And I will leave it there.
So, Kim, let me ask you what you'd like us to do. I see our students who are actually all dressed up and waving and drinking coffee, and they have their posters ready. And I know that they've got time on that, but so I'm not sure how you'd like me to. Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Yes.
Good morning. Your map of social vulnerability, it showed New Jersey, obviously. I was interested if you were able to tell us where that social vulnerability was.
It depends on the county. So I'd have to pull it up, but what you have would be places like Hudson County, for example, would come up high because of the very large both minority and ethnic population. Mercer County, which includes Trenton, would come up a little bit high too because of poverty indicators and so forth. So there's 42 different indicators. The index allows you to drill down into it to find out what in fact is driving it, which one of those factors is driving it. So it's easy to look at that, and it's on the web. The factors aren't on the web, but you could see how New Jersey and the counties within New Jersey compare, and you can download the data. You can download the scores, and then it also tells you the national percentile that is available. If you go to that website, and then if you look for SOVI, and we've put all that information out there for people to use, and we have a series of maps and so forth, so you can see how you rank, how your state ranks, and how counties rank to each other, and then we re-rank them within the state, so you can see the most vulnerable within the state. Yeah. California? Yeah. Now, these are pre-existing conditions. It's not vulnerable to something, but the existing social characteristics of those populations.
My question, I guess, for me is, what is it in humankind that has a need for privilege and uses domination of more vulnerable people? I think that there needs to be a criticism of it and acknowledgement, and where do we go from there?
It's sort of privilege to the theorist, yeah. No, I mean, you're absolutely right, but one of the things is that's what the movements and groups are all about, is bringing this sense of injustice and privilege to the fore. I mean, it's attention to this, and you know, it's hard to recognize it, you know, if you just take a single snapshot. But I think about the work that's been done in the last 20 years. You know, 20 years ago, nobody knew what environmental justice was. It wasn't a term. I mean, you know, you had books like this, but the concept that we could do injustice to people by dumping on them, it just wasn't in the public knowledge. It certainly wasn't in the knowledge in the discourse of the major environmental organizations. And I think that's, to me, one of the single most amazing and incredible accomplishments in the last 20 years is just the shift in understanding towards at least recognizing that. Now, what to do about it? You know, the movement is about you know, speaking truth to power. That sort of classic idea, and making it much more difficult to be that privileged. You know, unfortunately, you have something like Katrina that shows you haven't made a hell of a lot of progress in terms of implementation because it's right there. But this kind of data, you know, on this kind of event is just such a huge you know, bit of progress from what was there before. I mean, you can show the red spots. You can show how screwed people are, you know, in black, white, red. You know, it's right there. And again, I think that's the sort of speaking truth to the issue that the movement has done just a phenomenal job.
The other part of that is by highlighting those red areas, you know those communities and those places that do not have adequate preparedness for disasters. And by the same token, you know that those are the same areas, more than likely, that are going to need additional resources to help them recover, neither of which are forthcoming from the federal government.
We can take one more.
This is Nate, Professor Cutter, from this issue. Just wondering, is anything tracking how this data is being used by decision makers, by justice organizations, and also by industry, really in this situation and outside of the sort of various communities?
I spend a lot of time talking to DHS. I don't get anywhere. But my friends in FEMA understand it, and some of the social vulnerability indicators have actually started to make their way into state hazard mitigation plans. The state of California, for example, used it as part of their understanding of the differential populations that they may have to examine in the course of a seismic threat in particular. Where, I mean, you do the normal sorts of things, the web tracking and stuff, and we're finding a lot of state and local governments are using the information because they have a mandated planning requirement under the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, where they have to provide hazard mitigation assessments, but in order to do the hazard mitigation plans, they need to have some measure of their hazard vulnerability. I don't think it's gone into the environmental justice movement as much as I would like, in large part because we seem to be somewhat bifurcated between the environmental justice, which is focused primarily on toxics, but not exclusively so, and then the whole group doing Katrina, some of whom understand and come out of the EJ movement, but a lot of the people doing the research on Katrina are kind of new to it. So we haven't closed the circle in a way that I think we need to.
Well, let me give an example of where it actually worked. Where I'm from, there's a long and sordid history of uranium mining on the Navajo Reservation. And the price of uranium has skyrocketed in the last few years, and so the mining companies are all of a sudden getting very interested in coming back. And there are actually some test mines that were starting to be drilled, and the tribes came and said, look at the history and had the data. Here are the contaminated wells. Here are the tailings piles that are still there. Here are the illnesses that have come from that. Here's the rate of organ cancer on the reservation. And brought that, I honestly can't remember if it was Forest Service or BLM that was giving the permit for the test mines, but they stopped it. The agency actually said, okay, we're not going to do these test mines right now. And you just don't have that kind of victory, but it was based on this 20 years of data collection. Now, the company's going to come back and they're not done, but it was this information that really did impact the decision makers, which you just don't see.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's a good start to the day. We're going to take a break now. We've got a half-hour break, and I would invite you to take a look at the poster projects. Our students will be here to answer questions and engage with you on those. There's also books for sale. Many of the conferees today do have books out, and they'll be for sale in the lobby by Labyrinth Books. And we'll reconvene back here at 10:45 and try to stay on schedule. So thank you.